Look, I opened this jar of rotten baby food, and well, a butterfly came out.
Hmm. Well, that makes me think of Vlad the Impaler. There's an old myth that he had a court jester killed.
Welcome to the Comedians in Elevators podcast. I've got my guest, John Russo, here. John, say hi, introduce yourself, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right, hello everyone. My name is John Russo, and I'm coming at you from the beautiful state of Colorado. I am a writer, director, and producer who specializes in comedy. My passion in life is telling stories that make people laugh, and I do that through my studio, John Russo Entertainment. We just put out our first feature film, The Photographers, which I wrote and directed. It just hit Amazon Prime, Vudu, and DVD. It will be on Tubi.
DVD?
Yeah, yep, the real deal. It'll be on Tubi later this fall. Please do give that a watch. It is guaranteed to brighten your day. And
Awesome.
now that I've done my shameless plug, let me just say I'm super excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's get into it. You ready to get started?
Sure.
Listen, to my regular listeners, I know you don't like when at the beginning of these conversations I ask you to subscribe. None of us like it. I don't like saying it. I don't like it being in here. But it's frustrating. You know what else is frustrating? It's also frustrating when I look in the back end of the YouTube channel and I see that 56% of you that watch frequently haven't yet subscribed. And I know this because I see it in the comment section. You say things like, I didn't know I didn't subscribe. And that's actually what fuels the show. Basically, it's like you're making a donation to the show. So that's why I ask all the time, because it enables us to build and build and build, and we're going for the long term here. Hit the subscribe button, and we'll continue to build this show for you. That's my promise. Thank you to all you guys that do subscribe. It means the world to me. All right, so the whole point of the podcast is to compare and contrast the comic versus the comedian. So I define the comic as any person telling funny jokes versus the comedian who's a funny person telling any jokes. So, John, would you agree that you start as a comic and evolve into a comedian?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, one of the key differences between a comic and a comedian is the comic is telling jokes, while the comedian is telling stories. The comic doesn't have a narrative, the comedian does. And another thing that differentiates the two is improvisation. Improvisation. Uh, the comic, they come to the party with their script of jokes, which has been planned, rehearsed. They don't leave anything to chance. You see a lot of stand up where it's just an ongoing stream of one-liners, punchlines, jokes. There's not a lot of spontaneity to it. I'm that way. I'm more of a comic. I don't leave anything to chance. I'm not good on my feet. But I do think that a comic can evolve into a comedian if they learn to tell a story and tell it well. Um,
Okay, so you're saying that the comic actually is structured and therefore doesn't have spontaneity built in?
that's not to say that the comic can't have spontaneity. But I think in general, yeah, there's more of a structure there. And I think a lot of comedians will rely a lot more heavily on improv and spontaneity. Yes.
Okay, but the comedian also has narrative, which clearly has a structure. Would you argue? Perhaps many could see that that narrative structure inhibits spontaneity. Do you agree or disagree?
That's a good point. That's a very good point. Yes, that is possible. Because, and like I said, yeah, it kind of depends. You kind of have to go case by case. But yeah, if you have a narrative structure, it will limit, and that's another thing. That's something you can rehearse. So yeah, there's limitations there. Absolutely.
Of course, you can also add in moments of potential spontaneity within the narrative, right? So that way you have it kind of locked in, like this is the moment for spontaneity, which in theory is not possible, but in practice, perhaps it is, right?
That is true. Yeah, one of the greatest comedy improvers I've ever seen. His name is Bob Zaney. I don't know if you've heard of him, but you look him up when you have a chance. What he does is he converses directly with audience members, and he
Mhm.
gathers information about them. Finds out who they are. Their names, what they do for a living, and then he builds and weaves that information into personalized jokes and gags directed to that person. And he does this with dozens of members in the audience throughout the show. And he just builds on it. And he's a wizard at improv comedy. Um, but yeah, that he's one of the ones that I would say um, he's one of the most spontaneous. He does a lot of spontaneity in his shows. But obviously, uh, that's not the norm. That's something very unique.
Could you
Yeah.
define him possibly as improvisation narration?
Yeah, that sounds like it describes him. Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. So here's the first question. It's about the role of persona in comedy. So, how much of the comedian's voice is a character versus the real self?
Hmm. So let me give two answers to that question. The first
Okay.
answer deals with comedians who are up on stage, comics, comedians, etc. In that particular arena of stand-up comedy, there are two different breeds of comedian. One does his or her routine entirely as themselves, without any kind of persona or character. The other does it with a persona. In other words, they create a character or persona for themselves while on stage. Classic example, Larry the Cable Guy, right? Real
Mhm.
name's Dan Whitney. But when he goes on stage, he's got a persona, a character that he slips into. Same thing with Brian Regan, Jeff Foxworthy, a bunch of other guys. So that's that answer dealing with stand-up. Now, my other answer is going to come through the lens of making comedy for the screen, making movies as I do. As a director, I've seen it a lot where the comedian or the actor will take a character and purposely seek out traits of that character that they share, try and find themselves in the character. And again, even in the case of movies, it depends on the actor and their methods. Some can slip into a role that is 100% the opposite of who they are, and they can do it convincingly. Others have to find common ground between them and their character. A lot of times they'll change the character to fit their own personality, their own quirks. So ultimately, it depends on the comedian. Some stick to their real selves, while others, I think, are confident enough to take on more of a persona or a character. Just depends on
Okay.
them.
So, would you say that authenticity matters or is illusion part of the magic?
Hmm, I'd say that authenticity is necessary regardless of the illusion. Even if you are creating the illusion of a character or a persona, it still needs to be as authentic as you can make it. Because to me, authenticity is what draws people. That's what people are looking for in comedy. They come for the authenticity, they stay for the illusion. So yeah,
Ah,
authenticity is a must. But a good comedian can use it to create the magic of illusion.
I like that they come for the authenticity and they stay for the illusion. I like that. That's
Thank you.
definitely going to be the keeper catchphrase for this episode so far. All right. So punching up versus punching down. Where do comics versus comedians stand on this? So let me put it in some historical context. Did a jealous medieval prince become the first comedian by killing the
Beady,
court
beady, beady, beady.
jester?
Hmm. Well, that makes me think of Vlad the Impaler. There's an old myth that he had a court jester killed. I don't know why, but I just remember that he had a very dark sense of humor, and he often indulged it to creatively execute people he wanted dead. So I guess in that sense, the answer is yes.
I'll go with that one. So is the audience agreement with the comedian a form of permission or alignment?
Hmm. I'd say it's both. I think it kind of depends on what the comedian is choosing to lampoon and make fun of, obviously. But if an audience relates to what a comedian is saying, if they've experienced something the comedian is describing, they're definitely aligning with that comedian because they're going to say, okay, this person has felt the same things I felt or has had the same thoughts I've had. And when they connect with the comedian like that, they're going to naturally grant permission to go further to explore other areas, other topics. Let's see what else they've got, etc.
Mhm.
In movies, it of course depends on the character that comedian is portraying and whether or not the audience connects with that particular character.
All right. So, cultural translation of comedy. So, how do jokes that work in one country bomb in another?
Very good question. Um, yes, I think it's simply because of cultural differences. It's interesting from a filmmaker's perspective. When you make a movie in the US and it gets released worldwide, a good percentage of that movie's profits will come from other countries. At least nowadays. Didn't quite used to be that way back in the old days. It's fascinating because it's fascinating to realize that there have been comedies made throughout the decades that have resonated with audiences literally around the world. And these are the comedies that are very much steeped in American culture. They still have that American stamp on them. So what they were able to communicate, like universal human follies, things that everyone can relate to, everybody can laugh at because it transcends nationality.
Hmm.
So in essence, I think the reason a joke doesn't work in another country, and this is true of stand-up too, is because it's too specific to the culture it came from. It's not universal enough. It relates to a cultural experience only one group of people can even relate to.
Okay. So would you say here's an interesting one. Is truth the meaning of facts?
Hmm, that's a very good question. On the surface, I would say yes. Um, we we could probably get pretty deep into the weeds on that one.
That might be one to reflect on and maybe, have a follow-up on that because there are many ways to interpret that, right? So it's just a kind of a way to go deep real fast and then come right back up, right?
Yeah.
So would you say that comics are more universal while comedians are more culturally specific?
Um, I think either one can go either way. Going back to guys like Larry the Cable Guy and Jeff Foxworthy, their personas and their content are very much geared toward an American audience, right? The idea of a redneck or a hillbilly is kind of an American thing. However, uh, in spite of that limitation, both of those guys have done remarkably well in foreign markets. I think Jeff Foxworthy has sold quite a few comedy albums in other countries. So there's still something universal about those two comedians and their comedy, despite their Americanized content. Um, so yeah, a comedy, somebody who's just telling jokes is probably likely to be more universal just because a comic tends to deal with a kind of a broader range of comedy. There's so many jokes out there you can tell that, everybody gets and everybody, they're just simple enough to land with a big audience, but they're also, they also touch on something. But the comedian is, as you say, more specific to the culture. But I think either one can go either way.
Okay, very good. So crowd work versus crafted work. So if comics riff like influencers in the comments section and comedians perform like in reaction videos, where is the sweet spot?
Hmm. That's an interesting question. Well, I think the sweet spot would probably be um I don't know why that's a good question. Let me think about that a minute. I'll be honest, I'm not sure how quite to phrase the answer to that. Uh I know of course, using that illustration of comments section and reaction videos, you read comments on the internet on social media. There's always somebody who can find humor in whatever's being talked about. Plenty of comics out there and comedians. And they all can find an audience if they want to. I'm not super, I don't know. I don't feel like I can answer that properly, if that makes
It's a
sense.
hard question. It really is because I'm implying things you may not agree with, right? I'm implying that comics do riff and that they are like influencers. So now you have two things that you're like, oh, I don't know if I 100% agree with that. And then I'm saying
Right.
that comedians perform in reaction videos. And you may be like, I've never actually even seen that. So
Yeah.
is that true? Like perhaps there's a conflict with the presuppositions of this question?
Yeah, that might be what I'm struggling with. Yeah, because yeah, I'm not too familiar with that world of reaction videos and I mean I've riffed myself a little bit in the comment
Mhm.
sections, across social media. So I'm a little bit more familiar with that.
Do
But
you
I
feel
couldn't
like you were a comic in that moment?
I think so, yeah, because I was going for a punchline and I was going straight for a laugh and while other, and while other people were being so serious about something silly, I recognized the folly in it, and I was going for that. So yeah, definitely
Right.
more of a comic. Yeah.
I probably should add what you introduced here already about the idea of the comedian has a narrative and the
Yeah.
comic. What was the difference? The comedian had narrative, and you said the comic was different. How?
Uh, let's see. Yeah, the comic is telling jokes. The
Just telling
comedian is
jokes, right?
telling stories. Yeah.
The narrative with the comedian, it's kind of obvious, but then until you say it, you don't see it like that. So perhaps the reaction video and narrative go together. Would you agree?
Yeah, I could see that. Absolutely.
All right. So then,
Yeah.
then I could see like, where is the sweet spot? I have no idea. You're right. I don't know if this question is too complicated and not worth it, or eventually something will come of it. So we'll just move on to the next one. So what
Okay.
happens when a comic leans too much into crowd work, or when a comedian gets heckled?
Mm. Okay, let's see. So I'd say that if a comic is getting too much into the crowd, they need to redefine themselves as a comedian. If we go by how I defined those two earlier, excuse me, if they can work a crowd, it means they can think on their feet, they can improvise, and they're probably telling stories, which in turn that makes them a comedian. Now, when a comedian gets heckled, that means they can't tell a story. They can't think on their feet. So they probably need to redefine themselves as comics. That'd be my answer.
Okay, and then perhaps when they do that, they'll be able to evolve back into the comedian.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Kind of
Hopefully,
go back and yeah, relearns and
reevaluate.
yeah, absolutely.
All right, very important question. Advertising and self promotion. Who advertises themselves more, the comic, the comedian, or the magician? You know that place where you're not conscious and you're not sleeping either? That's your power bill to the electric company. Right here. I want us to be here with free energy, where the Wardenclyffe Tower meets the Eiffel Tower. But that's not where we are. We are here, where you've got the utility and you've got residential solar. Between these two, we know which one saves you money. This is where we can go in the meantime. But this is where I want us to be now, and this can be done now. So let me deputize you to represent DOSE, Department of Solar Efficiency, and let's get on the podcast to get the message out today. See you soon.
Hmm. I'd say all three are probably on the same boat in that regard. If you're looking to draw a crowd in any capacity, no matter what it is, what it's for, you can't afford to not advertise. Um, I will say that comics and comedians have a little more leverage in that, there are people, I'm not super big into magic tricks or anything. I mean, I don't mind Penn and Teller and stuff like that, but I think there's probably a little bit bigger audience for the comic or the comedian. Um, but I think that's the only difference.
Okay. So is self promotion seen as selling out, or is it necessary for survival?
I personally don't think so. What little success I've had in the movie business so far and in fiction writing before that is largely because I promoted my own work. I wouldn't have gotten where I'm at if I hadn't. There are consumers out there, obviously, who are turned off by self-promotion, who see it as a sign of a bad product, etc. So you have to consider that, but I say it's definitely necessary for survival. Yeah,
I'm curious of any consumer who really does see it as a sign of a bad product. But
they
that's an
do.
interesting. That's part of the question. Is yeah, there must be. And have you experienced it?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I write fiction from time to time, and I most of my self-promoting so far has been promoting my fiction. And of course, in fiction, I when you self-publish something, that immediately cuts off a certain amount of readers because they won't read anything that they can smell self-publishing on.
Right.
So that's one example. If they a lot I've talked to a lot of readers, a lot of movie watchers too, and a lot of them say the same thing. They go by word of mouth. If a friend tells them to check something out, then they'll check it out. They're not super impressed if the makers of that product are out there pushing it. Now, That probably only applies, now that I think about it, to stuff like movies, books, media, and stuff like that. It doesn't apply quite as much to other areas of life like clothing, food, etc.
That's a great point. Now, with AI, the emergence of AI, do you think that perhaps that's kind of another signal that self-publishing could be generated, at least in part, from AI? Therefore, if you have a traditional publisher or anybody, someone other than you publishing it, it's kind of a mark that it is not, probably not AI, because who would invest in a piece of writing that has potential AI content in it? Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah, AI. Yeah, I think AI is going to help um, distinguish, make that distinguish um, a lot easier to see. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
So it sounds like we need to get more traditional publishing online just to prove, or at least have that trigger of, hey, this is genuine, because other people, before it even got published, want to publish it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and it was bad enough that self-publishing had the image it did. And I think AI is only going to make that worse. And so yeah, traditional publishing is going to have to step up and kind of be the arbiter of quality now that AI has come on the scene, I think.
All right. Very cool. So censorship and offense. Does a comic avoid offense while a comedian courts it to prove a point, like a magician?
Ah, yes. For the most part, I'd say yes. However, both the comic and the comedian can offend if they try hard enough. If you're a comic telling dirty jokes, you're gonna offend somebody. If you're a comedian telling dirty stories, you're gonna offend somebody. Um, so yeah, I'd say yes for the most part.
Okay. So, so who survives better in the cancel culture environment? The comic, the comedian, the magician, or the mudslinger?
Wow. Um, Personally, I'd have to say the magician. Just because a good magician, he doesn't do a lot of talking. He's focused on his tricks. The comic and the comedian are doing the talking. Thereby, they're kind of at greater risk of saying the wrong thing. And mudslingers, they're just asking to get canceled, pretty much. So, yeah,
That's one
magician.
way to look at it. Or they're cancel proof because they're already canceled, right? They already
That
have
is,
that.
yeah, that is,
They're starting from the point of canceled.
yeah. That's funny. Yeah, I heard a comedian say something along those lines. I've already been canceled, so I don't have to worry about that. Yeah, so there you go. Yeah.
Exactly. So, timing and delivery, science or art. So, do comics rely more on structure and comedians more on rhythm and emotion?
Most definitely. And like I said, like we discussed earlier, that doesn't mean that comedians don't have structure. You have to know what you're going to talk about when you go out on stage. But this it still harkens back to the idea of I'm sorry, improv versus sticking to the script. A comic generally wants to know what he's saying at what time in the act. And like I said, they've got a script or a set list of jokes that they
Mhm.
rehearsed and that they're ready with. The comedian, yeah, and the comedian's done rehearsal, but they're telling stories, and stories do have rhythm and emotion, contrary to jokes for the most part. And they also allow for, again, spontaneity and improvisation. And I think they give the comedian freedom to play a little bit. So yeah, I would agree with that.
All right. So, laughter versus applause. Are comics chasing laughs and comedians chasing applause breaks that validate the message?
I think both are chasing laughs. But comedians are the only ones that get the privilege of those applause breaks. I think the comedian definitely gets to try things that a comic doesn't. They get to see reactions from the audience that is unique to them and the stories they're telling. But yeah, they want to make people laugh, there's no question. But a lot of times they also want the audience to know that they're not alone. If the audience can relate to or if the comedian can relate to an experience to the audience, like I said earlier, that's more than just laughter. That's connection, which the comic doesn't always get to feel in every case.
Very interesting. So, I mean, that's a great point. So comedy is commentary. So when does a comedian cross into being a philosopher or a preacher?
Hmm. That's a good question. I think all comedy is conveying truth to some extent. That's kind of the very nature of comedy. It's brutally honest about the human condition. So it's always getting at something bigger and deeper, but it's usually pretty subtle about it, right? So I think when a comedian stops being subtle about what they're trying to say, that's when they become a philosopher. Great example is George Carlin. The guy was
Hmm.
hilarious, but talk about social commentary, scathing social commentary, and the audience loved it. They ate it up, cheered him on. But I think it's because they realized they need to hear what he had to say.
So aside from George Carlin, is this good or does it dilute the humor?
Yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, the thing about George Carlin is, yeah, he could get away with it. He knew how to keep it funny on track, and he knew when, the fine balance. No, I don't think not every comedian can do that. 9 times out of 10, if a comedian does get philosophical, they ruin it for at least some of the audience. So it can be a good thing, but it can also be a really bad and disastrous.
All right.
Totally depends on the person and their level of skill.
All right. So board game Zoomcast, play versus performance. So if comedy were a board game Zoomcast, are you competing as the colorist, adding tone, mood, and shading, or the Foley artist, building punchlines with soundscapes and timing?
Hmm. I'd probably be, I'd like to think I would be a more of a colorist. 'Cause I like humor that is subtle, or I like the subtlety aspect. So yeah, probably a colorist is what I'd say.
All
Yeah.
right. Very good. So, does comedy work better when it's painted vividly, like a comic, I would argue, or when it's orchestrated sonically, like a comedian?
Oh man.
And do you agree that the painted vividly would be a comic?
Interesting question. Well, I think I do agree that the painting vividly would probably be a comic.
Okay.
Um, and I think it's hard to say which one is more effective because they both they both have their merits, and there's power in both. I would probably say the comedian is going to be mm,
Orchestrated sonically? Do you agree with that?
yes, yeah. Because again, it's no different than telling stories around the campfire, except here you're telling funny stories. So yeah, yeah. I think there's a little bit more power in what the comedian does. Yeah, sonically, absolutely.
Okay. But you would prefer to be the colorist, which we would argue is the comic as well?
Right, yeah. Because see,
Okay.
and I think why I'm drawn to that answer is probably because um just because I'm a writer and I do in a sense paint or paint that picture
Mhm.
through words, screenplays, novels, etc.
It's hard to write words or paint words that sound a particular way, and that's it has to be vocalized. But you can write it because there's alliteration or
Right.
other things, homophone and other
Yes.
things going on. But yeah, so that would be more sonic. All right, so we have a tradition here on the Comedians and Elevators podcast where the previous guest asks a question for the next guest. So the previous guest was Steven Zamora. And his question for you, John, is do you think cancel culture has damaged the role of the comedian in our society?
I do. I'm not gonna go on a rant about it, but I do think it has damaged. That's not to say that comedy's dead per se. It's close. But I think the problem with cancel culture is it instills fear in the performer, in the comedian, the comic,
Mhm.
and fear inhibits creativity, and creativity is crucial for what we do as comedians, comics, etc.
Mhm.
So in that sense, it has greatly dampened and hindered comedy in America. Um, it has that fear because a lot in the film industry. a lot of people have been talking the last 10 years or so about how, they're not making comedy anymore. And that fear is why studio
Yeah.
executives are terrified of what's going to happen if they put a joke in there that or a gag or whatever that is offends somebody, or they're just terrified. It's and they're frozen up with that fear.
Would you say a lot of that has to do with the administration inside the studio?
I think so. Yeah. Creatives and the people actually out there creating things, they're always going to be a bit bolder than the money people, which is why the money people and the creatives always clash and hardly ever see eye to eye, because the money people, they're they're extremely cautious because they're dealing in dollar amounts, the bottom line. But I think luckily the creatives will always, I think, balance that out with, okay, well, yeah, there's the bottom line to think about, but there's also honesty to think about. If you because good content is honest, good stories are honest. Yeah,
Right. So I would see it as risk mitigation versus authenticity, right?
there you
The
go.
creative artist wants to be authentic and make something original, but there's a risk to that, right? And so the the bean
That's it.
counters are like, we need to tamp down on the risk here. And it's like this big controversy, right? How do you make something? All right. So last question, legacy. Who gets remembered? Will the comics tight five survive time, or will the comedian's cultural point of view be more timeless?
Mm. Well, I think both can survive. If you've got a comic who knows what he or she is doing, the comic can survive. I'm gonna decide mostly with the comedian on this one too, because again, storytelling is powerful. Stories last. Stories are what give culture its uniqueness. Jokes last too, don't get me wrong. But again, there's something about stories. He who tells the stories rules society. I believe it was Plato who said that. He didn't say that he wasn't just you know, blowing hot air. So I think a comedian's take on the culture, on society, will outlast the comics string of jokes. I think George Carlin is kind of proof of that, really. Yeah.
All right. I'll go with that. So, John, where can everybody find you online?
Yes. So on Instagram, I'm John Russo Entertainment. And I'm working on building a TikTok account, but it's not quite ready yet. Also, my website, let's see, it's my website's kind of complicated, but you can find John Russo Entertainment on Facebook as well, and the website's on the Facebook page. Um, yeah, and then the
Very cool.
photographers, as I mentioned, is on DVD, Vudu, Amazon Prime, and coming to Tubi sometime this fall.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, John, thank you so much for being my guest. And for everyone, please like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.